want to talk about space games because space games are one of the coolest things that I've ever thought about playing, and they're also something I've never continued to play. It's interesting how you see the possibility of a really amazing space game and you get sucked in because the promise is you're going to be able to explore the galaxy. You're going to be able to go to the far reaches of space. It's going to be like the Star Trek TV shows or the Star Trek movie, Star Wars movies, or any number of other space adventures that you might have alive in your imagination, only it's going to be without borders. It's going to be complete freedom to go places, to explore things, to see things. It's an incredible thought. It's a fantasy that many of us have, to go up into the sky, to go beyond, and to touch the face of God. But the reality is those games never live up to that. And because they set their expectations so extremely high, what they promise to deliver is so outlandish. The reality is they never actually deliver. And they fall so far short of what they promise. It just is impossible to make a case for saying that they were even close to the mark. I think the first game that I encountered that was a space game was Space Quest, and that was an old, simple adventure game from the 90s, and I loved that game. It was essentially just an interactive story. It captured the concept of being in space, but it was certainly not an open world game. It was barely a game that allowed you to move your character back and forth on a two-dimensional screen. But it was cool because it told a good story. And that is really no different than Star Wars or Star Trek when I watched those TV shows and movies and fell in love with the concept of going out into space. But in more modern times, trying to find a good space game, I tinkered around with cell phone games like Star Trek Fleet Command, and ultimately the paywall and the fact that every cell phone game ultimately feels like every other cell phone game, because all they really are is toxic monetization hidden behind timers. Eventually I moved on to PC gaming, and I started to look at serious MMOs like Star Trek Online. And what I couldn't get past with Star Trek Online was the feeling that even though I could roleplay being the captain of my all-time favorite starships and interact with other people who were Star Trek fans in that game, it didn't feel like piloting a starship. It felt like ships weren't really able to move on all axes. Like you could go side to side, forward and backward, but you couldn't really go up and down. You couldn't fly upside down. There just was a limit to the type of movement you could do with a ship in Star Trek Online. It didn't feel realistic. Then you'd go explore in what was supposed to be the open world, to go fly around the galaxy, but it didn't feel like an open world filled with amazing places to visit. It felt limited. It felt kind of dead. It felt like there were very few reasons to interact with other players. And every time you'd go on an away mission or some sort of a ground mission to a planet, it always felt sort of boring and lackluster. It just didn't feel like what I had in my mind. That imagination of piloting an enormous ship, of feeling its movements, of seeing it in relation to other ships, and just having that sense of immensity, enormity, and scale. It felt more like playing a tabletop game than playing something that would immerse me in something as vast and as incredible as a galaxy to explore. I tried to get into Stellaris, the 4X grand strategy game, and managing spaceships in that game felt more just like managing icons on a computer desktop. It just didn't feel like it transported me into space. I tried No Man's Sky. I tried Elite Dangerous. And those games, again, are quite impressive in many ways, but they didn't feel like going to space as much as they felt just plain boring. They're not bad games, don't get me wrong. It's just, it's so easy to take the subject material of space exploration and to suck people in with false promises and then create something which is a galaxy across but a puddle deep. Does it really matter if you have an infinite number of destinations if every single one of those destinations looks thematically identical to every other destination? Does it really matter in No Man's Sky if you can fly to any planet that you can see, but you still don't have the freedom to take your helmet off inside the cabin of your own ship? Or in EVE Online, an amazing MMO with a realistic player-driven economy, but also a game that doesn't give you any opportunity to get out of your spaceship or land on a planet or build a house in some exotic locale. It's a game that lets you travel anywhere, but it doesn't really give you the ability to do anything. I'm not saying that space games are bad. To some degree, I just don't play them because I don't really have time to commit to every single game in existence. So I have to kind of pick my battles. And I like to pick a few games that I really enjoy instead of dabbling continually in every single one that exists. I'm sure I could have a good time in many of those games if I decided I was going to make them my main and only experience. But really, I'm touching more on a broader topic, and that is the promise that MMOs make and other games in general make to be something that lets a player do anything, go anywhere. They promise unlimited freedom, and then they fail because no game can deliver that promise. Some can come closer, but I think the ones that deliver better results are often the ones that don't try to promise everything. So without further ado, I wanted to talk a little bit more about my MMO experiences and why I quit so many different MMOs, because I think it's an interesting story. I remember starting to play RuneScape, and RuneScape did not impress me. Despite the fact I'd heard a lot about it, it didn't impress me because the graphics are just terrible. And it felt so dated. And the world, despite being one that's been around for a long time, it just doesn't seem like it's very big. It really doesn't feel like a world. It feels more like living in a medium-sized town. It just doesn't feel quite like a game world that's big enough to truly transport you. And some of that is just I got in late to the party. So starting to dabble in MMOs in the 2020 territory, probably just a little bit before or after the COVID lockdown started happening and all of that. Well, RuneScape was old news by the time I ever gave it a first try. But suffice to say, the graphics weren't very good, so I moved on, and I thought, well, I guess I'll try Black Desert Online, because Black Desert Online appears to have really amazing graphics. But what I found was Black Desert Online has terrible user interface. You install the game, and the graphics, despite being really good in some ways, just look kind of muddy. That's the best way I can describe it. Just enough to not give you a sense of clarity. And then it's hard to look at the world and feel like it's really original. And when you start to realize that the UI and the sheer number of different buttons you need to memorize to understand all of the different combat rotations, after an hour of playing Black Desert Online, what I remember is I really enjoyed the character creator, and every other aspect of the game felt essentially uninteresting to me once I loaded in. The world didn't feel memorable. There aren't any characters that make you remember them. There isn't anything about the UI that makes you feel like it's intuitive. And UI matters. When you feel like it's all backwards and it's confusing, there's a limit to how much time you want to spend in a game which is supposed to be fun being confused. So if the first hour or two of gameplay winds up being miserable, it winds up being very difficult to make a case to continue grinding through to hopefully maybe get to a part that's better. So Black Desert Online was one I crossed off the list. It just graphically was not quite as crisp and nice looking as I expected it to be. And the UI felt terribly unintuitive. And so I moved on and tried World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft initially starts off kind of cool. The tutorial seems kind of cool. And then before too long, you start to realize that the graphics are just terrible. It's nice that it's a big world you can explore. That's cool. But the graphics are kind of ancient. That's just the truth. I mean, you can say, well, that's just the art style, but you also can't get around the fact it's an old game. And despite the fact that nostalgia speaks, there's a standard you kind of want to meet as a minimum to have a game that looks and feels polished. And World of Warcraft doesn't really feel all that polished anymore because it's a pretty old game. But on top of it, there's things that I like about RPGs that World of Warcraft just doesn't have. It doesn't have a lot of options for character customization, really. Cosmetics are not really that much of a win in World of Warcraft, just because the game itself has such dated graphics. There's only so much to really see in World of Warcraft, and maybe it was impressive back in the early 2000s, but it's really not impressive now, especially if you don't have any nostalgia driving you to see it through rose shaded glasses. Then there's things like player housing, which are completely missing from the game entirely. So I just lost interest in it because the characters didn't feel memorable, the places didn't feel memorable, the graphics didn't feel interesting. And it goes back to that sense of being connected to a place. And for me, there just wasn't anything about the World of Warcraft world that made me feel a sense of connection or loyalty to it. So after a little while, I wound up giving up on it. Around that time, I did get into Genshin Impact, and I felt like that game, while not an MMO, totally transported me and took me to a different place. I really loved the world of Teyvat that was created for that game. It was one of the rare moments when I felt like a world had been created. There was something more than just a cool world made for a video game. It felt like the game was a way to connect players to a world that was bigger than just a game. And I think as years have passed and we've seen how big of a player base Genshin Impact has garnered, a lot of other people felt that way too. But nevertheless, Genshin Impact is not an MMO, and I do like the idea of being able to buy and sell and trade with other players and things like that. So I always continued to look for an MMO to play, though I have been a Genshin Impact fan ever since that game launched. And that led me to Albion Online. Started playing Albion Online, and I liked that game a lot because it's kind of paying tribute to ancient England. Of course, Albion is another word for England. So there's lore mixed in with the world of Albion Online, which is the Arthurian legends and the Tale of Camelot and all of those things, which I think are amazing. So I liked the world building of Albion Online. I liked the combat of Albion Online. I liked the player-driven economy of Albion Online. I liked just about everything about the game until I realized at some point I bought a player island. I filled it with things. I made money selling things. And I found that I didn't like going into the PvP areas because players are mean, cruel, toxic, and all in all, just essentially act like gang members trying to loot and rob people. And it isn't fun feeling like you can never talk to anybody in the game because everyone is just a mercenary out to get ahead at the expense of other people. The toxic player base that tries to win through unfair advantage, that gets old. And then you start to realize that the biggest part of the game is something that you actively avoid. And in terms of PvP encounters, it starts to be apparent that it's not fun to get beat over and over again. It's not fun to lose your equipment to a 10v1 where people come out and just kill you for fun. Like, that is not super fun. It just gets old. Even if you can afford it and it's not a terrible loss on the amount of silver you have in the game, it's not fun to be ganked or to be always watching your back, to where you can't just have a relaxing gaming experience because you have to try to survive in a ultimately hostile world. Then when you add to that the fact that there really aren't a lot of cosmetics, there's not a lot of things to do to customize your house in the game, there's not a lot of things to buy that you don't already have, then I realized, well, the only thing left to do in Albion Online is to make the number go up. I could have more silver, I could earn more money in the game, but ultimately there's nothing to do. There's nothing really to get that I haven't already done. So I realized, why would I continue to play a game where there's not any achievements I still want to get that I haven't already gotten? And the players are not the kind of people that I would really want to hang out with. When you combine toxicity with a lack of cosmetics and customization, it just ultimately was a game I really enjoyed and I still admire to this day, but I didn't want to continue to immerse myself in that culture of a toxic full loot PvP environment. So I was back to looking for other things. And I tried Final Fantasy XIV because it seemed like it had a player base of people who were friendly, welcoming, and enjoyed the more peaceful elements of role-playing in an MMO. And it is a cool game, don't get me wrong, but it is totally not an open world game. And that for me was the deal breaker. I like to be able to just go out my door, see what direction I feel like going in, and then just head off and explore. And in Final Fantasy XIV, you really can't do that. You're on rails. You go through one zone into another zone, and it feels like you're kind of going down a hallway. It just doesn't feel like a free roam open world experience. You have to do the main story quest in order to get to the late game zones. You can't even go there until you finish many hours of main story quest. And most of those story quests aren't voiced anyway, so it's just about like reading a book in order to get to the end game zones. And on top of it, I started to realize it didn't seem like the culture of the community was quite in line with what I enjoyed. It just seemed like people are a bit kind of weird. Like, I was watching videos about how there's people that have like an in-game sort of like a adult club, brothel kind of situation where people are doing some sort of role play ERP chat with each other. And that's not like the exception to the rule, that is the rule. Like, that's the main thing they're doing. Like, everyone's doing this kind of ERP stuff, sexting each other in a virtual game. And well, I think it's cool if people want to do something like that, but if that becomes the main thing that seems to be going on in the game, well, that's not the kind of a guild I wanted to join, right? So it just started to feel like the community in that game was a bit weird in some strange ways. And then when you combine that with the fact that the game lacks open world exploration the way I enjoy, that sense of being able to do anything at any time, however I want to, whenever I want to, well, I kind of lost interest in it. And then that's when I got into Guild Wars 2, because I saw the character creator and I heard some music from it. Josh Strife Hayes was playing it, and I watched that and I thought, oh, I'm gonna give that a try. It's a game that's not got toxic amounts of extreme monetization. It's a buy to play and then play forever kind of a deal. Only thing you need to buy is your DLCs, and that appealed to me, so I gave it a try, leveled a character up to 80, but again, it just didn't feel so much like an open world game, because each zone felt kind of small. It always felt like you can go off to explore, but you're going to hit the wall pretty quickly. And then it also felt like there's not a lot of customization other than cash shop things. So you could buy a skin out of the store to change the way your character looks, but there's not really a whole heck of a lot you're going to do in terms of crafting something or finding something in the game world to make your character look different. So it just kind of felt like there wasn't enough customization. There weren't enough cool, unique places to go. It just kind of didn't feel like as big of a game. And the graphics were not that great. It kind of felt like Final Fantasy XIV, but a simpler version of it that had less content. And despite the fact the monetization is pretty fair, and there's some things I liked about it, like combat being pretty fluid and pretty fun, it again fell short of being able to deliver on that promise of go anywhere, do anything, be whatever you want. And so somewhere in there I did try a bit of EVE Online, but like I was saying earlier, it totally doesn't deliver on the sense of being an open universe to explore, because all it really is a black screen and a little spaceship that you are piloting through the darkness of space without any opportunity to really do any true exploration. The best interaction you'll potentially have is some sort of mercenary behavior in a guild. And people say that EVE Online is very much like a spreadsheet simulator. So that tells you about how interesting and exciting that game is. It's cool to think about getting into it until you realize that it's going to probably never give you the opportunity to network with other people who are like-minded, or who are really, fun people to get to know. And it's going to be a game that wants you to treat it like a job. So that's kind of where I was at. I think that's about all the MMOs I played. Actually, what I did was I played New World. And crazy thing is, I guess I totally blotted that out of my mind for a minute. I played New World, probably about like 600 hours of New World. Because I like gathering, I like crafting, I like selling. And New World seemed like the perfect game for that kind of activity, because gathering is really fun in New World. Just hitting a tree hits different. It feels good. Combat in New World feels pretty good compared to tab target MMOs and other games that I've been talking about. So in many ways, New World had a lot going for it. And I got into the game, I tried to, but it just didn't feel like it had any soul. The world didn't feel like it was meaningful, didn't feel like there was any characters that had any purpose or meaning in the world. And then players were just kind of hating on their own game because they didn't like that there was maybe not enough content, or they didn't like the fact that it felt kind of generic and soulless. So New World, despite feeling like it was going to be a good game initially, it sputtered after launch, and it's just kind of been spiraling ever since. It's not really on track to capture the hearts and minds and imaginations of people for years to come. So I phased out of New World. I tried to get back into it from time to time, but never really felt enamored of it, never really felt like it was speaking to me. And in more recent times, every time I've logged into that game to try to give it another shot, just a few minutes later I wind up logging out because it just isn't really scratching that itch. And so that led me to Lord of the Rings Online. Someone said I should try it, so I did. I downloaded it, I gave it a whirl, and the truth is I had more fun in Lord of the Rings Online than I expected. But it is an old game. It is a game that is kind of janky. when it comes to tab target combat. Though I have to say the combat does feel pretty good in terms of old school combat mechanics. It feels pretty cool. So the combat is not terrible in Lord of the Rings Online. I think what really kind of did in the game for me is more just the fact that it doesn't have a very large player base. And so as someone who enjoys playing the economy, being able to buy and sell and trade, you really just can't do that in Lord of the Rings Online because there's not very many people playing the game at all. You could sell things, but you don't have the volume of players that you have in bigger MMOs. And again, the graphics are pretty dated. Not to say that there aren't some gorgeous aspects of Lord of the Rings Online. There definitely are. And I would have to say that despite all of its shortcomings, Lord of the Rings Online has one of the nicest, most pleasant communities. And it's one of the games that I have enjoyed more than most of the others. As a matter of fact, if I stopped playing Elder Scrolls Online, I would be seriously tempted to make Lord of the Rings Online my main game. But as it turns out, a couple of years ago, I decided I was going to give Elder Scrolls Online a fair try. So I installed the game. And initially I thought I didn't like the fact that there was no central auction house. I didn't like the level scaling in the game. But then after a little bit of time, I realized Elder Scrolls Online has the best housing system of probably any MMO out there. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, that has it behind an enormous grind and the RNG of waiting to see if you're going to be able to buy one of the limited housing plots in the game. ESO lets you buy houses all over Tamriel, and you can do it without having to go into a bidding war to do so. There's tons of cosmetic options, customization options to make your character look the way you want. And unlike pretty much any other MMO out there, you can truly go anywhere and do anything you want. There's so many different things, like the abundance of different towns and cities, and the fact that there's more individual quests to do in Elder Scrolls Online than I sometimes think I will have time to do in my entire lifetime. It doesn't really win at everything. There's some things the game doesn't win at, but it winds up being probably about the closest that I've ever come to a game where it feels like you can log in, you can do anything you want. You can head out of your door and go explore a strange land and find out interesting things about it and discover books of lore and immerse yourself in the stories and the adventures that you discover along the way. Unlike the main story quests of other games, main story quests are zone specific and can be done in any order in Elder Scrolls Online. So there's more than any other game I've experienced in the space, the sense that you don't have to start with the first quest and end with the last one. You don't have to do the quests at all. It's okay to not worry about getting to them until such a time as you feel like it. But when you do want to quest, there's always an NPC somewhere, not very far away, with something to tell you, something to do, if you happen to feel like you're in the mood for it. And if you're not, you can just run around collecting torch bugs and fishing. And that's okay too. The sense that you don't have to get anywhere to be accomplished, and you don't have to accomplish anything as a prerequisite to being able to go anywhere. That's something that makes ESO unique, and it's something that space games, other MMOs, games with a bigger scope, they struggle to really deliver that sense of being part of a shared world that's bigger than yourself, while giving the player a sense of freedom. That's a very hard thing to deliver, despite being something that just about every game promises. And if you think about real life, when you've had a sense of freedom, when you've been able to go out on a vacation or something and just experience the world, you really probably didn't do that much. It's not that you went out and accomplished some epic feat. It's just that you went outside, maybe you hit the road, but you knew that you could just head off and follow the path and go wherever it led you. And that sense of freedom without obligation, that's what makes you always want to go back for another road trip, another trip around the corner, another walk around to see what you might find if you go explore just a little bit further. And I think that's what's made me keep coming back to ESO, that sense that I do want to come back and do just another quest, or gather just a few more materials or resources. Not because I have to, but because I can. And of course, there is no game that can truly replicate the freedom and the expansiveness of actually living real life. But probably there's just about as much freedom to explore in ESO as there is in any part of our real life. You think about it, you tend to go to work at the same job, you have the same routines, you talk to the same people. We tend to be creatures of habit. So if you really think about it and you consider how boring many of our lives actually are, the reality is there probably is a lot more adventure, exploration, and freedom in the Elder Scrolls Online than there is in a lot of our real lives. Maybe that's sad, but it's probably not completely incorrect. In any case, that's just about the story. Games that promised the galaxy or the universe, and all sorts of MMOs along the way that promised that sense you can do just about anything. I've dabbled in almost all of them, and ultimately here I am. Seems like Elder Scrolls wins that bid of being an open-ended game where you can pretty much write your own story as you go. Love to hear your thoughts on it. What games have sucked you in? What is it that makes you feel like a game delivers on the promise of adventure? And what games have transported you to a place that feels real and meaningful? As always, thanks for watching.